All right, great. Okay, then we can start whenever you're ready.
All right, cool. Can I have access to screen share? All right, perfect. Can you see my screen? All right. So we're just going to be talking about databases today. We're just doing a slight introduction to SQLite. So I'll just talk a little bit about different database management systems. So there's SQL, MongoDB, and Neo4j. They're all kind of different, and they all like different pros and cons to it, just based on their own structure. So SQL uses rows and tables, and it's pretty organized and structured. So if you want to like query specifically into a certain row or something, then it's pretty easy to do it in SQL. There's also MongoDB, which uses documents and collections, and it's also pretty flexible, meaning that the collections don't really enforce document structure, so you can kind of make your database specific to whatever you kind of want. Neo4j is kind of graph-based, so it shows everything in like a graph kind of format. So it encodes relationships and has a little bit more insight into how everything interacts with each other. So yeah, today we'll just be focusing on SQL. So SQLite is just basically a library that implements a SQL database engine. So we choose it because it's simple, serverless, and self-contained, so it's pretty easy to implement in any kind of project. So in SQL, the data is stored in tables. We select columns from a specific table, and then where a specific condition is true for a row. So like in this case, ID is greater than 4. So if we wanted to make a simple SQL statement, it would look like select name and ID from employee info where ID is greater than 4, and it would result in this. So we see that Sally and Ben is printed because their ID is greater than 4. And we can also use logical operators to have multiple conditions such as and or. So we would select name and ID, specific columns that we would want from the employee info, where the ID is greater than 4, or the name is equal to David. So we would result in the same table we had before, but instead we would also have the one where the name is equal to David. So as a review for right now, basic SQL statements will look like select some blank columns from a specific table that you'd want. We can also add where to specify certain conditions, and inside these where clauses, we can compare values with greater than, equal, less, not equal to, and also logic such as and or not. So we can also sort by using order by. So if we select the same columns, name and ID from employee info, it would result in a table that looks like this. But if we sorted it by like order by name, then it would alphabetically sort it by name. So we'd go Ben, David, Mary, and Sally. Also, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat. I know I'm kind of going fast, so. So we can also define the direction of the order with ascending or descending. So if we select name and ID from the employee info table, and the order by name is descending, then it would result in the table descending by alphabetical order. If you wanted descending, you don't really need to specify because it by default automatically does ascending. So we can also restrict the query with limits. So if we did the same query, such as select name ID from employee info, and we order by name alphabetically ascending, and we limit it to 1, then it prints out the first row of that new ordered table. So Ben would be printed out instead of Sally if we didn't put order by. So we've seen 5 different clauses, select, from, where, order by, and limit, and they always go in this order, and you don't really particularly need every single one except for select and from. So we can also use aggregate functions such as sum and average, and we can also do like statistics with these kind of functions. So if we select average balance and sum balance, and we add a count, which basically just prints out the number of rows you would want. So count 1 would just be 1 row printed. If we did count 5, then it'd print all 5 different rows. So if we do it from employee info, then it would print out the average balance for all these rows, and then the sum of the rows, and then the count, which is 4 because there's 4 different entries in the table. So we can also look for aggregates for each group using group by. So if we add a department such as sales, finance, and tech, we can select the department and then get the average balance for each department. So if we select it from employee info, then we can see if we group it by the specific department, then the average balance would be based on whatever we grouped it by. So department sales is average balance is 119, just because of Sally and David's aggregate balance. So all of the 6 clauses were select, from, where, group by, order by, and limit, and they will always go in this order, and you don't really need all of the clauses except for select and from, which are necessary to create a basic statement. So if you take away anything, just know that you can select rows and columns from a specific table using the keyword select and from. So that is it. Yeah, sorry. If anyone has any questions, you can submit it in the chat as well. I don't think you can see it, but I'm assuming not. So now we can step into SQLite with Python, so we can kind of see what it does in context. So I can send this in the chat as well. And you can just kind of fork it and just kind of mess around. Let me, there's chat. Okay. Cool. Let me do a new share. Sorry. Okay, cool. So here we see that I've set up a basic Python file with SQLite 3, which is the same as SQLite, it's just a specific version. So we import SQLite just so that it knows that this is what we're wanting to use. And then we connect to the database using SQLite.connect. And then if there is an existing database, you would want to put that name. Or if there's not one, it would automatically create one by itself. And then we can also use, we can also create a cursor using con.cursor or the variable.cursor. And that's basically what you use to, to create everything. And then there's also a commit that commits all of the changes that you make, and close, which closes the connection just for safety. So if I run this, it basically just sets up a basic database right here. So there's different kind of functions that you can use. Let's just first create a table that we can call from. So if we create a table, you just use the cursor function, cursor dot execute. Oh, I cannot spell, sorry. And then we want to put it inside a docstring just because that kind of simplifies the way that it runs everything, just so it knows that you want to run everything that's inside these quotation marks. So just like how other SQL statements are pretty simple, it is also pretty simple and kind of readable. So it's create table if not exist. And this just basically creates a table if there does not exist a table already. If you don't put this just if not exist and then you kind of run it twice, it would kind of put out an error and be like, this table already exists. So that's really handy to keep if you're running the function more than once. And so we can define the table such as employees with the variable name employee, employees. And then we can define what kind of variables go inside this table. So if we wanted a name, just like the last table, and we want ID and their email. So we also have to define what kind of variable these are. So there's 5 different kind of data types. There is a null. Well, let me write these out. There is a null, and that basically if it doesn't exist, then you would want it to be null. And if it's an integer, you would want it to be an integer. And if it is a decimal or like a float kind of, you'd want it to be the real data type. And if it's like a string, you would put it under text. And if it's anything else, like images or an MP3 or any type of weird format, it would be a blob. Just be that I don't know exactly why it's called a blob, but it's kind of what it defines, I guess. So here we would the name would be a string, so we would want to define it as a text data type. And then the ID, we would want to define it as an integer. And for email, we would also define it as a text. So if we run this, it just basically creates a table. You don't really see anything yet because there's nothing in the table. And if you click on this, it kind of does not look very pretty. So you can just kind of set that aside. So we first want to add some values into the table. So we want to, I guess we can insert values into the table. So we'll just do cursor execute, and everything will be run in this kind of function. So everything will be cursor execute and then parentheses and then different kinds of variables or whatever you would want to throw in there. So here we would, if we want to insert a value, we would do insert into, because it's pretty similar to English. And then we want to define the table that we would want to put into. So this case would be employees. And then we would want to set it to values so it knows that we're trying to insert specific values into the table. So if we want to follow the similar structure, we would want to add someone's name Sally and their ID being 5. And then we can also add their email, which is just sally@gmail.com. So this is pretty simple. If we run this, it'll also just insert this into the table. We won't be able to see it yet, but yeah. And there's different ways to insert variables. We can insert just one, but we can also insert many. So if we define a variable multiple employees, and then we set it equal to an array that contains different kind of data. So it would be similar to this kind of structure. So we would put a name like David, and then we would put his ID as 1, and then his email as david@gmail.com. And then we can also enter some other data such as Ben, ID 7, Ben at gmail.com. And then we can add another one just to keep consistency, 3 Mary@gmail.com. So in order to add this, it's kind of similar to how we ran it before, but instead of just execute, you want to do .execute many just to be sure. So, oh, it looks like someone else did something. Okay. Yeah, so basically you can just kind of add any kind of function. So if this function was ran, it would add Ansh and then his ID being whatever number this is, and then his email. So if you wanted to add the multiple employees, we would do the similar thing as to what we've seen, but instead of just .execute, it would be .execute many. And then we would also want to do insert into employee values, but instead of this being the placeholder, we would want to put question marks because that's how SQL is defined, just placeholder terms. And also we would want to set add the variable that we defined, so multiple employees. So if we ran this, we see there's no errors, and we can't also see the data. So I'll show you how you would be able to see the data. So there's 3 different kinds of ways you can kind of fetch the data. So there's c.fetch1, which just fetches the first term. So if we ran this, it would be Sally because that was the first term we'd entered. There's also c.fetchMany, and then in here you would define an integer, and this would be the first however many rows that you'd entered. So if we ran this with the 3, it would print out Sally, David, and Ben, just because those are their first 3 that were in the database. And there's also a c.fetchAll, which we'll use just to see all the data that's in the database. And we would want to print this just so we can be able to see what is going on. So if we printed this, oh, looks like there's an error with one of the functions, sorry. I'm not too sure why this is doing this. Let me see. Well, let's see if c.fetchAll works. Yeah. It should be displaying all the data, but I'm not too sure why it's just giving me an empty array. Let me try deleting this. It looks like it's not actually pushing it to the database, which is very interesting. I've never seen this before.
What the heck? This is new.
Yeah, it was literally working like a few minutes ago.
All right, time for high quality debugging. What the heck?
Let me just
Table
do.
employees already. Okay, so the table's there.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it's doing this. Maybe it's because there's more than one person on here, but it shouldn't because the functions are still the same.
Weird.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Well, in theory, it should be printing all the data and it would be printed kind of like in this format. So it'd just be an array with different data points inside. And it should be printing it to the console, and I'm not sure why it's not doing that right now.
Huh, well, hopefully it works if you do it in your own code editor.
Yeah, definitely. It's all the same code. I'm just not sure why. Probably Replit is not liking what I'm doing. So we can just like query the database. So let's just kind of move on from this. So we can just query we have in the database. So it's kind of the same as before. So it's the c.execute, which is the cursor execute function, and then the 6 quotation marks just because it's a doc string. And then just as we've seen in the actual presentation, it would be select and then whatever name or whatever columns you would want. So in this case, it'd be name and ID, and then from employees, which is the table that I defined. So this should technically print what it would. I'm not sure if it would work just because of what's been happening, but oh yeah, see. So we selected the name and ID from employees, and it's actually queried the actual data out. So we see Sally's ID is 5, Ansh's ID is whatever number that is, David's ID is 1, and then it kind of adds more data points into it the more times I run it. So if I kind of code this out, then it won't add any more data points to it. Comment that out. We from here we can also define more functions. So if we did where ID is greater than 4, then we can also run this, and then it shrinks it to everyone whose ID is greater than 4. Or we do name is equal to David, like we did in the example. And then we see David has been added, even though his ID is not greater than 4. So from querying the data and inserting data, we can also update records. So we can go up here and we do c.execute like as we did before. And with this doc string is before, we can put update, and then we put the table that we would want to update from, so employees, and then we put the word set, which means that we're setting whatever variable we put next into this new variable. So we want to set the name Joy in place of where the ID is equal to 5. So from what we defined it, Sally's ID is 5, so it should be updated with Joy's. So if we run this. Yeah, so here every instance of Sally has been replaced with Joy because the ID is equal to 5. So that is how you update. You can kind of mess around with it and do like different IDs. Like you want to set the ID is equal to 7 where someone's name is, I guess we can do name is equal to David. So here we know that David's ID is now 7. And you can kind of just mess with that and update new different employees, and then you can also insert new people and edit their data from there. And with the update function, there's also a delete function. So we do the same structure as before. And now we can delete different kind of rows. So we do delete from, and then the table, which is employees, where let's say the name is equal to Joy. So then every instance of Joy would be deleted, as we can see whenever it loads. Yeah. So every instance of Joy has been deleted. And we can also see everything if we do print.fetch all, and then we do select this asterisk, which means just selecting everything from the table. And then we can delete this and we can see everything that's inside the table. Oh, it looks like. Oh, extra. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so everything that's in the table would look like this. With Python, you can iterate through each row and kind of make it look prettier. Just like the base data will look like this, it will be in an array, and then whatever data you put in parentheses for each array item, I guess. So yeah, there's 3 different ways to kind of insert into and then update and then delete. So we can just kind of delete whatever you would want, and you can also update whatever you want just with these simple functions. I think that's kind of what all I've prepared for today. I know I went a little fast, so if there's any questions, you just let me know.
Cool. I don't think we have any questions.
Yeah, sorry about the technical error too. I did not expect that to happen, so whoops.
That's okay. I don't, now that I think about it, I don't even know if you can use fetch before you write the select statement.
Yeah, now that I'm thinking about it, I might have just misplaced where I was putting it. Yeah, so, but yeah.
Oh, well. All right, good stuff. Thanks everyone for coming. As always, this will be posted on YouTube very, very shortly if you need to refer to it again. And feel free to reach